Imagine living in a house where the footsteps you hear climbing your stairs at midnight are the same footsteps your father heard as a child, and his father before him, each generation learning to sleep through the sound of something that should not be there. In a quiet Connecticut town during the 1960s, the Holsworth family had done exactly that for longer than anyone could remember, passing down not just property and possessions, but something far more sinister, a presence that had claimed their home long before any of them were born and had no intention of leaving. This is the story of a haunting so deeply rooted in one family's history that they had forgotten it was possible to live any other way, and of the investigators who would teach them that acceptance of the supernatural is not the same as safety from it. The call came to Ed and Lorraine Warren from a woman whose fear was sharpened by the fact that she was the only one in her household who still recognized it as fear. She had married into the Holsworth family and moved into the old family house where her husband had grown up, expecting nothing more unusual than the ordinary adjustments any bride makes to a new home. What she found instead was a house where her children woke screaming from the upstairs bedroom, where footsteps crossed the empty hallway after everyone had gone to bed, and where her husband responded to her terror with the calm assurance of someone who had heard these same sounds his entire life and considered them simply part of living in the house. He was not dismissive of her concerns, but he genuinely could not understand why she found alarming what he had learned decades ago to ignore. His siblings, when she called them in desperation, confirmed that yes, the footsteps had always been there, yes, the upstairs bedroom had always felt wrong at night, and yes, everyone in the family had simply accepted these things because what else could you do? It was this normalization, this multi-generational accommodation to the presence of something inhuman that would ultimately disturb Ed and Lorraine Warren more than the haunting itself. By the time the Warrens began investigating paranormal cases in volume during the 1960s, they had already established protocols that set them apart from other investigators of their era. They did not simply show up, look around, and offer opinions. They conducted formal intake interviews, took photographs, made audio recordings, and maintained detailed written documentation of every case they accepted. They understood that credibility in a field dismissed by mainstream science required rigor that many of their contemporaries did not bother with. The Holsworth case came to them through these formal channels, and from the moment Lorraine Warren read the initial interview notes, she recognized it as something beyond the typical haunting. The consistency of the phenomena across generations, the fact that the same locations in the house produced the same experiences regardless of who occupied them or when, suggested an intelligence that had learned the house intimately over decades and had no intention of relinquishing its claim. When the Warrens arrived at the property, Lorraine immediately focused on the staircase that descended from the upper floor. The family had described the footsteps that climbed these stairs night after night, and as Lorraine stood at the base of that staircase in the afternoon light, she felt the layered history of the phenomenon. There were not just footsteps here, but presences, multiple impressions left in the fabric of the space by events and entities from different times. One presence she identified as residual, a kind of spiritual recording that played back without awareness or intent, the echo of someone who had once lived in the house and whose movements had been impressed into the location through repetition or emotional intensity. But there was something else as well, something that responded when she extended her awareness toward it, something that noticed her attention and regarded her in return. This was not a recording. This was an entity with consciousness and will, something that had occupied the house for so long that it considered the space its own and the human inhabitants' temporary inconveniences to be endured or ignored. Following the trail of this conscious presence, Lorraine moved to the upper bedroom that every family member had described with the same words: wrong, cold, unwelcoming, impossible to sleep in once you woke in the deep hours of the night. She spent close to an hour in that room while Ed interviewed family members downstairs, and what she sensed there confirmed her worst assessment. The entity had not simply visited this space or passed through it, it had claimed it. The coldness that guests reported, The coldness that no amount of blankets could address was not a drop in air temperature, but a spiritual void, a presence so antithetical to human life that the body registered its proximity as freezing even when thermometers showed normal readings. Lorraine had encountered this phenomenon before in her years of investigation, and she had learned that cold of this kind was diagnostic. Residual hauntings, mere recordings, did not produce it. Only entities with intelligence and intention could create that specific quality of wrong cold. The cold that came not from the absence of heat, but from the presence of something that existed in opposition to the warmth of human life. Ed Warren, while Lorraine conducted her psychic assessment, pursued the historical research that formed the foundation of his investigative method. He reviewed property records with the family's help and traced ownership of the land back through deeds and transfers to the mid-19th century. What he found were two incidents in the documented history of the property that involved sudden death and emotional trauma, the kind of events that Ed had learned over years of investigation could create conditions allowing inhuman entities to establish themselves in physical locations. He shared his findings with Lorraine, and together they developed the assessment they would present to the family. This was not a case of a human spirit lingering after death. This was an inhuman entity that had used moments of tragedy and emotional vulnerability in the property's history to gain a foothold, and had over the span of more than a century become so entrenched in the structure that the family could not imagine the house without it. When Ed Warren sat down with the Holsworth family to explain what he and Lorraine had found, he focused on a point he knew would be difficult for them to accept. The husband had lived with this presence his entire life. His father had lived with it. The haunting was as much a part of the house's identity as the staircase where the footsteps sounded or the bedroom where the cold held vigil. But longevity, Ed explained, was not the same as harmlessness. An entity that had influenced 3 generations of the same family, that had taught children to accept as normal the presence of something supernatural in their home, had done spiritual and psychological damage, whether that damage was visible or not. The husband's inability to recognize the danger his own children were in, his learned response to suppress alarm and accept the unacceptable, was itself evidence of how deeply the entity had worked its influence into the family's identity. This was not a haunting to be lived with. This was a haunting that had already taken too much and would continue taking until someone chose to stop it. The intervention Ed Warren arranged was not a simple house blessing, but a full property exorcism, a rite that required authorization from the diocese and the participation of clergy specifically trained and empowered to confront inhuman entities. The ceremony was conducted over the course of an entire day, beginning at dawn with the blessing of the property's exterior boundaries and moving systematically through every room of the house. Lorraine was present throughout, her psychic sensitivity allowing her to track the entity's responses and communicate to the officiating priest where resistance was strongest and where the prayers needed to concentrate. The exorcism was not a quiet or peaceful process. In rooms that had been sealed during the ceremony, objects were found disturbed when the doors were reopened. The temperature in the upper bedroom dropped so severely during the focused prayers there that breath became visible and participants had to pause to warm themselves before continuing. But Lorraine felt the shift when it came, the moment when the entity's hold finally broke and the presence that had occupied the house for generations released its claim and was driven out. In the days following the exorcism, the Holsworth family reported what they described as the strangest experience of all, stranger even than the years of footsteps and cold and waking dread. The house was quiet, not just free of phenomena, but genuinely quiet in a way none of them could remember experiencing before. The staircase was simply a staircase. The bedroom was simply a bedroom. The husband, who had spent his entire life in that house and had never known it without the presence, told Ed Warren that he felt as though he were living in a completely different building, that he had not realized how much psychic weight the entity had imposed on the space until that weight was lifted and he could feel the absence where it had been. His wife, who had been the one to call for help, described it as though the house could finally breathe. The Holsworth case became one of the foundational examples in Ed Warren's lectures on multi-generational hauntings, cases where paranormal phenomena had persisted across so many years that families had integrated the haunting into their understanding of normal life. These were among the most dangerous cases the Warrens encountered, not because the entities involved were always violently active, but because the long duration of their presence allowed them to work changes in the families that were profound and largely invisible. Children raised in homes where the supernatural was normalized grew into adults who could not recognize danger when it stood in their own hallways. The psychological and spiritual damage of such long exposure was real even when it left no physical marks, and the fact that families like the Holsworths had endured for so long made the intervention more difficult but also more necessary. To break a haunting that had lasted for generations, to reclaim for human habitation a space that had been shared with something inhuman for longer than anyone living could remember, represented for Ed and Lorraine Warren the deepest purpose of their work, and the reason they had dedicated their lives to confronting the darkness that most people preferred to deny existed at all. Hashtags number Ed and Lorraine Warren, number paranormal investigation, number haunted house, number true horror story, number ghost story, number exorcism, number demonic haunting, number supernatural history, number Connecticut haunting, number Vanishing Roads, number scary stories, number horror documentary, number true paranormal, number Warren Files, number real haunting. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.